Hi there, this is Carl Irwin with a quick look at MuseScore 4 and some sequencing tricks for realistic playback. As I've been discussing in some previous videos, there are some things about the MuseScore playback engine that are problematic, and some of those things really can never be resolved because of the concept of relativity in articulation and dynamics and interpretation of music. So, meaning that dynamics don't actually mean the same thing all the time. For all pieces and all situations for all instruments. There's a relativity to that changes from piece to piece, player to player, situation to situation, moment to moment, and creating a library that treats these dynamics and articulations as universal will never play back realistically directly from score. You need to create a playback file in order to sequence the most realistic possibilities from MuseScore or any play from notation kind of engine. So what we're doing is we're incorporating the concept of MIDI sequencing, which is a total control, individual total control over all parts, all instruments that allow you to target realism over accuracy of notation. You have to remember that notation is not music. Notation is merely just a hard copy representation of what music is. Music is sound. Music is only sound. Music is only ever sound. Music is never notation. Notation is not music. Only when it's played is it music. So getting a play engine that will play from notation absolutely accurately is kind of a fool's errand, but that doesn't mean that they can't make some improvements. I'm sure they will with the sample set and with some of the interpretations in the notation over time. But really, to get after realism from any kind of engine, be it a MIDI sequencer, a digital audio workstation with sampled sound sets, sampled libraries, VSTs, whatnot, or from a play from notation engine, you will have to noodle around and massage everything to make it exactly what you want. And the good news is that we can do this in MuseScore. So I just want to share a quote with you. I'm not sure if this is actually a real quote or not, attributed to Gene Kranz, who was a mission flight director at NASA during the Apollo era. He was famously in charge during the Apollo 13 situation, and he is depicted by the actor Ed Harris in the movie Apollo 13. And in the film, there is this quote, and I think it comes from his mentality. I don't know if he actually said this in reality, but it does grasp what we're looking for. There's a scene where they're arguing over what a piece of hardware can do, an engine in particular, and he says, "I don't care what anything was designed to do. I care about what it can do. I don't care what anything was designed to do. I care about what it can do." This is, in a nutshell, the mentality of a MIDI sequencer. Someone who does music production through MIDI sequencing and mock-up using sampled sound sets and input controllers. We don't care what things were designed to do. We care about what they can do. What can you get out of something in spite of what the notation says or what a play from notation engine might interpret? If you adopt that mentality, you can actually get some pretty solid realism out of MuseScore 4 just the way it is right now. And I practice what I preach. You'll hear me harping on the forums about a lack of video sync and MIDI timecode sync, or the ability to do what we used to be able to do for quite some time, which is score to picture. This has been removed. There hasn't really been a lot of discussion about replacing it or what they're going to do about it, and they're spending a lot of time on some other things, which I personally find some of those things very superficial and kind of surface level when there's major back-end capabilities that have just kind of been struck. For reasons I don't fully understand. I do understand the complexity of those back-end capabilities, but they're important, and I hope they come back. I practice what I preach. I'm still scoring from MuseScore 3.6, even though 4 won't do it. But in the end, that's going to be depreciated, and there won't be anything to use unless they get this capability on this platform. That's not really the case with what we're talking about here. The play engine, the way it is, can get you pretty absolute real results with some tweaking. If you just import some of that mentality, we don't care what things are designed to do, how they were made to work. We care about what they can do with some manipulation. So here's just a couple of examples that I've heard some gripes about. Sforzando forte piano, which can be interpreted the same way by some players. It's an accent on a note that is sudden and momentary. And then here we have a pulled back to piano, and then I've put a crescendo on here. So these two are what MuseScore does. This is what you have to do to make it sound the way you want. Now, you're not going to use these figures all the time. You're not going to make music where you're throwing these particular dynamic articulations on notes constantly. These are kind of subtle moments in a work typically, which means that it's easy to just kind of dig in and do a little bit of sequencing on it with the notation. Again, some of this massaging to make it sound right. So here's what it does sound like. Here's what you can make it sound like. If you just listen carefully. So you can see here, even though the dynamics change not suddenly, but over the period of a beat or a half a beat, in one place here, two places I just rearticulate at a new dynamic. So you kind of have a note hanging out in reverb, and then it rearticulates, excuse me, at a lower dynamic, and then you have the crescendo on it. This is really what we want this to sound like. But MuseScore can't really do that. It gives a universal application of what it's interpreting, and it's done without a sample. They're merging a couple samples together. Here we can get a crossfade effect, and if we offset what's going on so that not every section's doing exactly the same. Imagine if you layered on top of this solo strings as well, panned them to different locations, and then subtly changed this figure, such that the violins might have a solo violin or violin 1 and violin 2, but they're not actually changing dynamics at exactly the same time. I can put this accent on the beginning to get that heavy articulation at the beginning, which is what I want from the sforzando or the piano. But then if I decrescendo over the course of a beat or half a beat or rearticulate after 16th, you then get a composite of a section which sounds like forte piano crescendo, and it sounds considerably more realistic. This is the kind of stuff that you have to do to get realism from MuseScore 4, but you can get realism from MuseScore 4. You are not stuck. You can get realism from MuseScore 4, because we don't care what anything was designed to do. We care about what it can do. What can you do with some manipulation? Here's another example that I've heard pop up is the glissandi. Now, arguably, this isn't perfect, but if you have other things going on, you'll hear how the second version much more accomplishes what we're after. Now, glissandi means that we want to take a string and we're going to go from one note to another just by moving the finger up the fret, up the fingerboard, and then we get a connected sound. Now, there's some dynamic implications to how that actually happens, which I've accounted for over here, and some kind of mishmashing that I'm doing. And I'm using the glissandi tool, but I'm also adding in a bunch of other chromatic notes, plus a legato slur, plus dynamic control that's offset to get the result. So here's what it sounds like in MuseScore. Here's what it can sound like with some massaging. Again, this is a unique thing that you wouldn't be doing all the time. You would do it once or twice in a particular section of a piece. So it's not that much work to kind of dig in, given that the rest of the play engine plays so well. Here's what it sounds like. Here's what we can make it sound like. So you can see when we overlay and create a composite, so we have notes starting a little bit later, we have differing cross rhythms so that we don't have exactly the same metrical run, right? We've got 32nd notes down here in duple meter. We've got triple meter up here in 16th notes. We have a duple meter and 16th notes down here, plus an overlay of some glissandi that MuseScore already does, plus the dynamic changes that are offset. And we get a much more workable variation on this. We can get realism in MuseScore. We can get this to sound the way it's supposed to by doing things like this, because We don't care what anything was designed to do. We care about what it can do. We care about what we can manipulate and how we can kind of create an illusion given the tools that are available. Here's another example. This is an example with a trumpet part. Now I'll play it and then we'll talk about what's going on here. Simple little Baroque-like ditty. And here's the big issue. There's two big issues. There's one huge one though, is that the the samples are very limited, not just on the sound samples, the Muse Sounds, but also with respect to the classic sounds too. That they have a cap. MuseScore says instruments can't play higher than this. Well, they can. They can. Trumpet players often go higher than what it's limited at, even on a B-flat instrument. So this is very Baroque sounding, probably more like a piccolo trumpet. But what I've done here is I've just kind of cross-faded in using the notation an oboe sound just to cover that note with other things happening. It sounds actually more real than what you would expect because the timbre would change up there. Now, if on Linux, if I had access to the audio effects, which we Linux people do not as of yet, but if we did, I would EQ this instrument. I would bring out the mid-range frequencies and the low-range frequencies. I would take off the top edge, and I could make this sound a lot more like a trumpet, make it fit in better. The second thing, which is big, is that you can see how much I'm massaging this with articulations and dynamic changes to get it to sound more human. I can't just say mezzo forte here at the beginning and let it play through mezzo forte. I have to add all of these very specific changes to make it sound like a player is playing at mezzo forte throughout and breathing in places. So the addition of articulations, particularly on exposed parts, the addition of dynamics, the crossfading of other instrumentation that can cover for notes that are outside of playable range, these are all very good tactics you can use to get MuseScore to sound realistic, because we don't care what anything was designed to do. We care about what it can do. Good luck with that. Happy mixing.